Thank you very much indeed for joining me. You've called these ceasefires part of an evil strategy, psychological warfare. Do you think Russia has any interest in stopping the violence?
Well, I mean, listen, Russia has to play a variety of different games. It does play the diplomatic game on the international level, where it does want to show that it can be the potential peacemaker in Syria or in specific areas of Syria. But at the same time, I think when you look at Russian domestic media, when you look at how the Russian Air Force and its ground forces have postured themselves with regards to East Ghouta and specifically, everything is pointing towards a Russian determination to actually secure a regime victory in eastern Ghouta. So any talk from the Russian side about a ceasefire, as far as I can see, is all a kind of methodical component or a methodical part of a broader strategy to secure that victory. So for Vladimir Putin to offer a 5-hour ceasefire in the middle of the day, that's not a ceasefire. You can't have a ceasefire in which for 19 hours of the day civilians are being indiscriminately bombed in an unimaginably heavy level, and then for 5 hours it pauses. I don't think that can be called humanitarianism as much as a psychological warfare strategy in which civilians are given a brief pause to come out into the open and to put pressure on the armed opposition, I assume, to surrender.
How much influence does Russia have over the Assad regime at this point? Could they actually do something if they wanted to?
Well, that's actually the most important question. And, you know, we're hearing political figures in Europe and in the United States who repeatedly are making the judgment that it is only Moscow that can secure, you know, a regime acceptance of a ceasefire, a regime attendance to Geneva or wherever the political talks are taking place at that time. But the reality on the ground, I think, is actually something a little bit more complicated. When we look back at previous significant regime pushes, like in Aleppo last year, in Homs before that, it's actually been Iranian militias or Iranian-influenced ground troops and the regime army that has launched those operations, and it's actually only been later that the Russians have joined in. In another kind of example, when there have been big diplomatic agreements that Russia has been part of, it's more or less been, again, Iranian-commanded militias and regime troops that have violated those agreements, undermining Russia's diplomatic standing in the international community. So actually, I don't think we've got a great deal of evidence that the Russians have the influence that we want them to.
But if, as it seems increasingly likely, Assad does retain power, what should the US strategy be long-term?
And again, that's really another big question. So I think looking at Syria over the last 7 years, looking at where we are today in 2018, I don't think there can be any real question that Assad is staying. What does that mean for US strategy? Well, when you hear, as we have in the recent past, Secretary of State Rex Tillerson say very publicly that Assad is still going to have to leave as part of a politically negotiated transition, and that US strategy is focused on removing Iran from Syria, you know, we really have to raise the questions, well, how exactly are we going to achieve those objectives with the very little leverage that the US and its allies, including the UK, have actually established on the ground? And those are open questions that I don't think we really have an answer to yet. And I think the question of what is the US strategy is very much an open question. We've heard the vision, where we haven't had any kind of laid out design from the White House, from the State Department, from the Department of Defense that actually explains how we're going to achieve those objectives.
Charles Lister, thank you very much indeed for joining me.
Thank you.